In June of 1847, during the peak of Carolina's flood season, a woman was taken from her home before dawn. Her name was deliberately erased from the record. She was chained at the ankles, weighed with iron, and dragged to the edge of the Waccamaw River, swollen and violent from 3 days of rain. Witnesses later testified that the man who ordered it, Edmund Calhoun Whitaker, planter, magistrate, church benefactor, never raised his voice. At sunrise, the river closed over her. The official ledger recorded 1 drowning. But 3 days later, farmers 2 miles downstream found a woman alive in the reeds, mud-caked, fevered, unchained, clutching broken iron as proof she had not imagined it. That same morning, Whitaker was discovered dead. Not in the river, but in its old bed. Overnight, the river had shifted course. Water abandoned him, mud claimed him. And by the end of that week, every document connected to the event was sealed, misplaced, or quietly destroyed. This is not folklore. This is what remains of a drowning that failed and a river that remembered. Before we return to 1847 and the carefully laid design of Edmund Calhoun Whitaker, take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications so you don't miss what follows. Let us know which state you're listening from. Now, let's go back to the Carolina lowlands and the year before the river changed. In order to understand how a woman could be chained and cast into a river, and how the man who ordered it could later be mourned publicly, we must first reconstruct the world that allowed such an act to occur without immediate consequence. The place was the Georgetown District of South Carolina, a low-country jurisdiction defined in the 1840s by tidal marshland, blackwater rivers, and rice fields engineered through forced labor. Georgetown town itself sat along Whitaker Bay, its wharves crowded with rice barrels branded in indigo ink, its streets lined with brick homes owned by families whose fortunes depended entirely on human property. In the year 1843, the district operated under a legal and social order that made certain lives visible and others expendable. Enslaved people outnumbered free whites by nearly 3 to 1. Women, regardless of status, were barred from voting and severely restricted in court testimony. Married women existed under the doctrine of coverture, their legal identities absorbed entirely into those of their husbands. Enslaved women possessed no recognized personhood at all. Within this system, violence was not aberration, it was infrastructure. Standing comfortably within this order was Edmund Calhoun Whitaker. Whitaker was born on February 11, 1809 to Josiah Whitaker, a successful rice planter, and Martha Calhoun Whitaker, a distant relation to the politically influential Calhoun family. His education was private and deliberate. He studied under tutors before a brief enrollment at South Carolina College in Columbia, where he was exposed to classical rhetoric, Roman law, and the language of moral philosophy, tools he would later use not to question power, but to stabilize it. By the early 1840s, Whitaker had become a respected figure throughout Georgetown District. He served as a lay magistrate, a treasurer for the Whitaker Bay Agricultural Society, and a vestryman at Prince George Whitaker Episcopal Church. His signature appears on land transfers, probate inventories, sworn affidavits, and church minutes. Contemporary descriptions portray him as restrained, orderly, and charitable in public demeanor. One vestry record from 1844 describes him as measured in speech, dependable in judgment, and steady in the stewardship of men and property. What those records do not capture is the discipline with which Whitaker divided his public respectability from his private administration. His primary holding was Calhoun Reach Plantation, situated along the Waccamaw River, roughly 12 miles upriver from Georgetown by boat. The estate encompassed nearly 1,900 acres of rice fields, timberland, and marsh. A sawmill operated year-round. The enslaved quarters were arranged in 2 precise rows, separated by a central lane kept deliberately clear of vegetation. The main house, constructed between 1836 and 1838, followed the Carolina plantation classical style, raised foundation, wide piazza, fluted columns, and a central hall designed to funnel air through the structure during the oppressive summers. Inside, the house was meticulously ordered. Walnut staircases imported from Charleston connected 2 floors of 14 rooms. The furnishings were modest by planter standards, but the library was extensive. It contained agricultural manuals, legal commentaries, and several medical texts addressing anatomy, poisoning, and nervous disorders. Whitaker believed strongly in self-education, particularly where authority and discipline were concerned. An inventory taken in 1845 lists 63 enslaved adults, 14 enslaved children, 11 iron collars, 27 sets of shackles, and 4 items recorded simply as disciplinary chains, river-weighted. The inventory provides no explanation for the final category. None was required. Among his peers, Whitaker was regarded as an innovator in plantation management. His yields were consistent. His labor force experienced fewer reported deaths than neighboring estates. At agricultural society meetings, these statistics were cited as evidence of enlightened stewardship. What the figures concealed was not mercy, but methodology. Whitaker believed in what he privately referred to as controlled breeding. Fragmentary notes recovered decades later describe his conviction that labor populations could be regulated through strategic pairing, enforced separation, and psychological pressure. Women were assigned reproductive partners without consent. Children were removed from parents before adolescence and reassigned to other estates to prevent what Whitaker termed counterproductive attachment. The system was cold, intentional, and entirely legal within the framework of the time. Punishment, too, became increasingly systematic. By 1845, Whitaker had moved beyond spontaneous correction toward what he described in correspondence as deterrent spectacle. A man accused of theft might be confined in an iron standing frame for precisely 6 hours, released, then subjected to the same confinement weeks later to reinforce memory. A woman accused of insubordination could be paraded briefly through the quarters wearing a weighted collar, then returned to labor as if nothing had occurred. The objective was not pain alone, but instruction. For those who threatened the integrity of the system, those who resisted assignments, observed patterns, or accumulated knowledge, Whitaker might contained a final method: removal without record. Drowning during flood season left minimal evidence. Rivers shifted, banks collapsed, and bodies traveled far from the point of entry. In a district where enslaved deaths were often recorded as numbers rather than names, absence rarely invited inquiry. What distinguished Whitaker's approach was his insistence on documentation. Each removal was preceded by notation, justification, and witness acknowledgement. Violence unrecorded invited rumor. Violence documented could be reframed as necessity. In April of 1846, a new entry appears in Whitaker's ledgers. It identifies a woman only as H, female, age approximately 28. She had been purchased from an estate along the Black River and transferred to Calhoun Reach at the beginning of planting season. Within weeks, she was reassigned from field labor to domestic service. The ledger notes her literacy as a distinguishing feature. That reassignment marked a shift. Domestic servants moved through spaces denied to others. They handled correspondence, overheard conversations, and noticed discrepancies. They saw who was missing and when. According to later testimony, the woman began asking questions, not openly, but carefully. She observed the river's behavior during flood season. She noted where the current slowed, where the banks softened, where the water abandoned old channels. There was no one in Georgetown District positioned to challenge Whitaker without consequence. The physician who attended his household relied on his patronage. The lawyer who notarized his documents had married into his family. The overseer was illiterate and deeply indebted. The church depended on his donations. And the woman, whose name history does not preserve, possessed no legal standing whatsoever. She could not testify. She could not accuse. She could not vanish without explanation. The Istum was prepared. The paperwork was complete, and the river, he believed, would finish the work. The first person to realize that something inside Edmund Calhoun Whitaker's system did not behave as planned was not a magistrate, nor a planter, nor a minister. It was a boy who had no authority, no protection, and at 16 years of age, no understanding of how quickly knowledge could become fatal. His name was Thomas Ezekiel Granger. Thomas was born in 1831 on a small parcel of land outside Georgetown, the third son of a cooper whose barrels supplied rice shipments along Winyah Bay. By 1847, Thomas was apprenticed to Mr. Lucius Pinckney Harrow, a clerk who managed correspondence, inventories, and legal filings for several plantations along the Waccamaw, including Calhoun Reach. The work was tedious, but it placed Thomas near documents most boys his age would never see. It was in Harrow's office on the morning of June the 6th, 1847, that Thomas first heard something that contradicted the official record. Two planters stood near the window speaking in low voices. They believed the clerk was out of earshot. One of them, Benjamin Rutledge, a distant cousin of Whitaker, kept repeating the same phrase. "She was found alive," Rutledge said. 2 miles downriver, alive. The other man told him to lower his voice. Thomas did not understand the significance yet. Drownings were not unusual during flood season. Rivers took people every year, but what followed unsettled him. Rutledge's voice shook as he added, "And Whitaker? God help us. Whitaker is missing." By noon, the rumor had hardened into something more specific. A body had been recovered, but not the one expected. Edmund Calhoun Whitaker had been discovered submerged in mud near an abandoned bend of the Waccamaw, a channel the river had abandoned sometime during the previous night. There was no water flowing there when the men found him, only suctioning clay, heavy and wet, pulling him down. The clerk's office received instructions before sunset. All correspondence related to Calhoun Reach was to be collected, sorted, and forwarded to the district magistrate's archive. Harrow worked through the night. Thomas assisted. It was during this sorting that Thomas encountered the ledger. It was not labeled. It was bound in dark leather and heavier than most plantation records. It had been placed incorrectly among shipping manifests, as if someone had moved it hastily. When Thomas opened it, he noticed immediately that it was written in Whitaker's hand. The entries were precise, dated, and unlike anything Thomas had seen before. There were columns not for yield or expense, but for names, some abbreviated, some crossed out entirely. Beside them were annotations: reassigned, removed, paired, unproductive, disposed during flood. One section caught Thomas's attention. It listed iron weights, chain lengths, and river depths measured at specific points along the Waccamaw. Another contained crude diagrams of the riverbank, noting currents, eddies, and erosion patterns. Near the back of the ledger was a folded page inserted loosely between entries. It contained a list titled simply, "Those Who Know." 3 names were scratched out. 1 remained. Thomas did not yet understand who the woman was, but he understood enough to know that the ledger was dangerous. Before he could say anything, Harrow took the book from his hands and closed it. He told Thomas that some records were not for apprentices to read. He instructed him to forget what he had seen. Thomas did not forget. Over the following days, Whitaker's death was discussed publicly as a tragic accident. Floods were blamed. The instability of riverbanks was cited. The church bell rang. A service was held in Georgetown, though Whitaker's body, recovered in poor condition, was not displayed. Mourners spoke of his charity and Sayum's tediness. His absence, they said, would be felt. The woman found alive was not mentioned. Thomas began asking questions quietly. He learned from dock workers that a woman had been pulled from the reeds downstream near Sandy Bluff, weak but breathing. He learned from a ferryman that iron had been found nearby, broken open. He learned that she had been taken away under guard before dawn the following day, destination unknown. When Thomas asked Harrow whether any statement had been taken from her, Harrow's response was immediate and sharp. "You will not pursue this," he said. "You will let it pass." That night Thomas returned to the office alone. The ledger had been placed in a locked drawer. He knew where Harrow kept the key. What Thomas found on his second reading was worse. The back pages contained medical notations copied from texts Thomas recognized, treatises on poisons, nervous suppression, and paralysis. Whitaker had copied passages describing substances that produced weakness without pain, confusion without delirium, and death that mimicked natural illness. Marginal notes recorded dosages adjusted by weight, sex, and tolerance. One passage was underlined twice. Symptoms may progress over days, allowing the subject to remain conscious yet increasingly incapable of resistance. Thomas copied several pages by hand and hid them beneath his mattress. Within a week, he fell ill. At first it was subtle. Fatigue that did not improve with rest. A metallic taste in his mouth. A trembling in his hands when he tried to write. Harrow assumed the boy was overworked. He told him to eat more. The symptoms worsened. Thomas began vomiting in the mornings. His limbs felt heavy, as if his muscles no longer responded fully to instruction. He complained of numbness in his fingers, then his feet. His vision blurred intermittently. He remained fully aware throughout, acutely conscious of his own decline. A physician was summoned, Dr. Samuel Worthington Peel, a man who had treated Whitaker's household for years. Peel examined Thomas briefly. He attributed the illness to nervous exhaustion, possibly aggravated by damp air and poor constitution. He prescribed rest, laudanum, and tonic water. The laudanum made the weakness worse. By the third week, Thomas could no longer stand unassisted. His speech slowed. He reported episodes in which he could hear everything around him but could not move or call out. Peel dismissed these as hysterical manifestations common in youths of overactive imagination. Thomas knew what was happening to him. He attempted one final act. On July 2, 1847, he dictated a letter to Harrow's wife, detailing what he had seen in the ledger and what he believed Whitaker had been doing. He named names. He described methods. He begged her to deliver the letter to the district magistrate. The letter was never sent. Thomas Ezekiel Granger died on July 6, 1847. The cause of death was recorded as febrile wasting. His funeral was small. Whitaker's relatives attended. Harrow spoke of the boy's diligence. Dr. Peel signed the death certificate. No autopsy was conducted. Thomas was buried in a pine coffin on the outskirts of Georgetown. Years later, when the cemetery was partially relocated, his coffin was found crushed inward, the interior lid bearing deep scratch marks near the face and shoulders. No official explanation was recorded. The ledger was sealed with the rest of Whitaker's papers. The system continued, and the river, having already shifted once, settled into its new course as if nothing had happened at all. What followed Thomas Granger's death did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded with the patience of a system confident that it would never be named. Edmund Calhoun Whitaker's estate did not dissolve with him. It reorganized. Within weeks of his burial, Calhoun Reach Plantation passed into the stewardship of Nathaniel Brooks Whitaker, Edmund's younger brother, a man with fewer ambitions and far less curiosity. Nathaniel retained the same overseer, the same physician, and the same legal counsel. The ledgers remained sealed under the justification of probate complexity. The workforce remained intact, adjusted only where Whitaker's annotations had already dictated change. To the outside world, nothing appeared disrupted. Yet within the quarters, patterns resumed that had existed long before the river shifted. Women were reassigned without explanation. Children were removed at specific ages and transferred to neighboring properties tied through marriage or debt to the Whitaker family. Men who resisted pairings were disciplined publicly, then sent away under vague pretexts. The mechanisms Edmund Whitaker had designed proved transferable. What distinguished the years after 1847 was not innovation, but repetition. Between 1848 and 1856, at least 9 individuals disappeared from Calhoun Reach under circumstances that never entered the district's death registers. Their names survive only because fragments appear in secondary documents, cloth allowances reduced without explanation, tool inventories adjusted, labor tallies rewritten mid-season. One of them was Sarah Ann, recorded in a church baptismal ledger as the mother of 2 children born 6 years apart. In 1851, her children were reassigned to separate estates within the same month. Sarah Ann herself vanishes from all records shortly afterward. A ferryman later testified, years later in a statement dismissed as unreliable, that he had been paid to row a woman upriver at night during flood season, instructed not to ask questions, and told to forget the location. Another was Isaac Cooper, a carpenter whose skill made him valuable and whose literacy made him dangerous. He had been assigned to repair storage sheds near the riverbank and was known to linger where he should not. In the autumn of 1853, he was accused of theft. No trial record exists. His tools were redistributed. His name appears once more, crossed out, in a work ledger dated October 17th. The river was high that week. The physician, Dr. Samuel Worthington Peale, continued his practice uninterrupted. His account books show regular purchases of substances used to treat nervous conditions and intestinal distress. He billed the Whitaker estate for consultations that do not correspond to recorded illnesses. In one instance, he charged for a house call on a date when no patient was listed. The lawyer, Charles Montford Alston, notarized transfers and affidavits that reclassified human beings as unproductive assets or reassigned labor, language sufficiently vague to withstand scrutiny. Alston's papers reveal a habit of drafting duplicate copies, one filed publicly, one retained privately. The private copies disappeared after his death. The overseer, Jeremiah Cole, enforced discipline with mechanical consistency. He could not read, but he could count. He knew how many were present at sunrise and how many returned at dusk. When the numbers changed, he was told not to ask why. Rumors circulated, as they always do, but they were fragmented, localized, and easily dismissed. A woman who claimed her sister had been taken during the night was punished for insubordination. A man who spoke too openly was sold south. Children learned quickly which questions led to separation. In 1854, an outsider arrived in Georgetown whose presence briefly unsettled the arrangement. His name was Henry Augustus Llewellyn, a printer and correspondent from Charleston who had been assigned to write a series of articles on inland trade routes and river commerce. Llewellyn was not an abolitionist. His interest was logistical. He wanted to understand how rice moved from field to port, how rivers were managed, how labor was organized. What drew his attention was the Waccamaw itself. Comparing recent navigation charts with older surveys, Llewellyn noticed discrepancies. The river's course near Calhoun Reach had altered significantly in a short span of time. Local explanations cited flood behavior, but Llewellyn found that the shift corresponded precisely with a stretch of bank reinforced years earlier with timber and stone, work that would have required planning and labor. When Llewellyn asked who had overseen the reinforcement, the answer was always the same: Whitaker. Llewellyn requested access to plantation records to corroborate his findings. He was denied politely. He asked dock workers about nighttime traffic upriver. They became evasive. He spoke with a ferryman who mentioned an incident years earlier, then refused to continue. Llewellyn wrote to his editor expressing concern that certain estates operate under customs not fully reflected in public documentation. The letter never resulted in publication. Llewellyn returned to Charleston within months, citing illness. The pattern remained invisible to authorities because each incident, viewed alone, appeared unremarkable. Flood deaths were common, reassignments were legal, illnesses were attributed to constitution or climate. The law required intent, witnesses, and named victims, elements systematically removed from every case. Within the community, silence was reinforced by benefit. Merchants depended on Whitaker contracts. Clergy relied on donations. Families intermarried. To challenge the system was to isolate oneself economically and socially. And so the years passed. By 1860, the plantation's records showed fewer irregularities, not because the practices had ceased, but because they had been perfected. The system no longer required experimentation. It ran on precedent. Then the country fractured. The outbreak of the Civil War disrupted trade, emptied coffers, and redirected attention. Men left. Records were neglected. Overseers were replaced. For the first time in decades, continuity faltered. During the chaos of 1862, Calhoun Reach was partially abandoned. Union naval activity along the coast made rice cultivation untenable. The enslaved population scattered. some fleeing, some forcibly relocated, some simply unaccounted for. Nathaniel Whitaker retreated inland. Dr. Peel died that winter of a sudden respiratory illness. Charles Montfort Alston burned a portion of his papers before relocating west. What remained were structures, altered land, and a river that no longer followed its original course. In the years immediately following the war, freed people returned to the area cautiously. Some avoided Calhoun Reach entirely, others claimed the ground near the Old Riverbed was unstable, that it swallowed animals and tools, that water pooled where it should not. A few spoke of voices heard at night, not crying out but murmuring, indistinct, repetitive, unresolved. No formal investigation ever took place. By the time Reconstruction officials arrived with questions about land use and labor practices, the men who could have answered them were dead or gone. The ledgers, when requested, were said to have been lost during wartime displacement. The river charts were outdated. The witnesses were scattered. The system had done what it was designed to do, and though its architect lay buried in mud rather than honored ground, the structure he built had already outlived him. What finally disrupted the system was not conscience, nor law, nor exposure. It was instability. By the winter of 1862, the Low Country no longer resembled the world that had allowed Edmund Calhoun Whitaker's methods to function without interruption. Union gunboats moved along the coast. Rice exports collapsed. Currency lost meaning. Authority fractured into overlapping jurisdictions that communicated poorly and trusted one another less. Calhoun Reach Plantation stood largely silent. The main house was shuttered. The sawmill ceased operation. The quarters emptied unevenly. Some people fled inland, others were forcibly removed by Confederate requisition, and some simply vanished into the marshlands that bordered the river. Nathaniel Brooks Whitaker, ill-prepared for crisis and lacking his brother's appetite for control, abandoned the property by early spring. What remained was land altered by years of deliberate engineering. The reinforced banks near the Old Riverbed, neglected without maintenance, began to fail. Timber supports loosened, stone placements shifted. When heavy rains returned in March of 1863, the river behaved unpredictably. Water cut into soil already weakened by excavation. Sections collapsed inward, revealing older layers beneath newer reinforcement. It was during one such collapse that human remains surfaced for the first time. They were discovered by a group of formerly enslaved men scavenging timber along the bank. The remains were partial, bones caught in exposed roots, fragments of clothing embedded in silt. What drew attention were the iron fittings still attached at the ankles, chains, corroded but unmistakable, linked to weights designed to pull a body downward. Word spread cautiously. No one contacted authorities. The war had taught people what official attention could cost. Instead, the remains were reburied hurriedly farther inland, marked only by stones. Over the following months, more surfaced, sometimes after storms, sometimes when the ground collapsed unexpectedly, always near the abandoned bend, always incomplete, always accompanied by iron. By 1865, the war had ended, but the reckoning did not take the form many expected. There were no trials for what had occurred at Calhoun Reach. Reconstruction officials were overwhelmed. Jurisdictional boundaries shifted. Records were missing. Witnesses were gone. But rumors persisted. Local accounts recorded decades later by Works Progress Administration interviewers describe a night in late April of 1863 when Nathaniel Whitaker briefly returned to the plantation. According to these accounts, he intended to retrieve family papers, rumored to be hidden beneath the main house. He did not return. Two competing explanations emerged almost immediately. One claimed he fled inland and died elsewhere under an assumed name. There is circumstantial evidence for this. An unmarked grave in Sumter County, a probate notice bearing a similar signature. The other account, repeated more consistently, places Nathaniel Whitaker near the river on the night of his disappearance. According to three separate testimonies, each given years apart and never reconciled officially, Whitaker was seen near the Old Riverbed after dark, carrying a lantern and accompanied by no one. Heavy rain had fallen earlier that evening. The ground near the abandoned channel was unstable. When Nathaniel Whitaker's body was discovered weeks later, it was found not in open water but partially submerged in mud at the edge of the former riverbed. His legs were trapped, his arms were extended forward, there were no signs of external violence. The official conclusion, such as it was, attributed the death to misadventure. Those who saw the body noted something else. His mouth was open, his hands were clenched, and the mud around him bore impressions suggesting prolonged movement rather than sudden collapse. No investigation followed. By the time federal authorities briefly took interest in abandoned plantations along the Waccamaw in 1866, Calhoun Reach was already considered unsafe. Portions of the land had sunk. The river's altered course made navigation difficult. Surveyors recommended leaving the area unused. The main house was dismantled for materials. The quarters collapsed gradually. The reinforced banks were left to erode. Survivors dispersed. Some settled in nearby towns. Some moved north. Some changed their names. A few carried stories they told only within families, stories of chains, of water, of nights when the river did not behave as it should. Deaths followed in quieter ways. Dr. Samuel Worthington Peele's grave was never marked. Charles Montford Alston died in obscurity, his papers destroyed. Jeremiah Cole disappeared from all records after 1864. Justice did not arrive as verdict or sentence. It arrived as instability, as land that would not hold, as water that refused to stay where it had been forced. By the time Georgetown District resumed something resembling order, the system Edmund Whitaker had built no longer existed, but neither had it been fully exposed. Its components lay scattered, incomplete, and unacknowledged. The reckoning was real. It was also unfinished. Decades later, when the land was surveyed again for development, engineers noted something peculiar. The soil near the abandoned bend compacted unevenly. Structures built there failed repeatedly. Foundations cracked. Water pooled where no waterline should have existed. Local residents avoided the area. They said the ground remembered. By the time the 20th century arrived, Calhoun Reach no longer existed as a named place. It appeared on no modern maps. What had once been a plantation became, in fragments, timber lots, marshland, and unclaimed river edge. The Waccamaw's altered course was accepted as natural history. Floodplains shift, engineers said. Rivers forget. But land does not forget easily. In 1908, a rail spur was proposed to run inland from Georgetown to support expanding lumber operations. Surveyors flagged a stretch near the former river bend as unstable. Test borings revealed voids beneath the surface, pockets of soft earth that collapsed under pressure. One report noted unidentified obstructions of iron and wood encountered below the waterline. The route was adjusted. No excavation followed. In 1921, a group of children playing near the marsh uncovered a rusted length of chain after heavy rain. It was taken to a local blacksmith, who remarked that the iron was of an older style, forged for weight rather than restraint. The chain disappeared shortly thereafter, reclaimed by an adult who offered no explanation. The most significant rediscovery occurred on October 14, 1931. During courthouse expansion behind the old cemetery in Conway, workers struck a collapsed wooden chest buried deeper than expected for a standard interment. Inside were three objects: a corroded iron shackle, a slate ledger wrapped in oilcloth, and a folded river map marked in red ink. The map showed a course of the Waccamaw that no longer existed, annotated with depth measurements and marginal notes in a precise, disciplined hand. The ledger bore no title. Its handwriting was identified, quietly, internally, as belonging to Edmund Calhoun Whitaker. The discovery triggered a brief internal review by county officials. References were cross-checked against surviving 19th-century dockets. One file, Emeritus, get a chancery proceeding from 1847, sealed and later listed as lost during renovations in 1889. It referenced one unnamed woman, 4 sworn witnesses, and a charge never tried. No press announcement followed. Within weeks, the ledger and map were transferred to a restricted archive. Access required written permission from the county board. That permission was never granted. In the 1940s, a graduate student from Columbia University, Margaret Louise Harrow, a distant relative of Lucius Pinckney Harrow, requested access while researching low-country land disputes. Her notes, preserved among her personal papers, reference irregular removals, river-based punishments, and a juvenile witness who died under questionable medical care. Her advisor discouraged further inquiry. In 1954, a journalist reviewing WPA interview transcripts noticed repeated references to the bend where the water left and the man the river would not take. When she requested access to related property records, she was told the files were incomplete. Her article was never published. What survived instead were fragments. Oral traditions persisted among families who never wrote anything down. Stories told cautiously, often without names. Children warned not to play near certain stretches of marsh. Fishermen who avoided anchoring where nets caught on submerged iron. Elders who spoke of a woman who returned from the river and a man who did not. The woman's fate remains unknown. No burial record exists. No transfer document survives. Some accounts claim she was moved inland under guard and died shortly thereafter. Others insist she lived, changed her name, and left the state entirely. There is no proof either way. What is known is that after June of 1847, no further river-based removals appear in surviving Whitaker-associated records. Something ended that year. Today, descendants of the families involved live throughout South Carolina, many unaware of the ground beneath their histories. The site of Calhoun Reach lies abandoned, unmarked, and officially insignificant. Portions of it are state-managed wetlands. Other sections remain privately owned but unused. Developers still avoid the area. Engineers still note irregular subsidence. After heavy rain, water still pools where it should not. And occasionally, according to local reports that never quite make it into print, objects surface after storms. Iron, wood, things shaped for weight. The archives remain sealed. The ledger remains restricted, and the river continues to flow along a path it was never meant to take. Some secrets buried in the Carolina Lowcountry were not erased, they were merely displaced. And like the river itself, they may never return to where they began. What do you think really happened here, and what was never allowed to be written down? Share your thoughts below. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and pass this story to someone who listens closely to history's darker corners. We'll see you in the next investigation.